I woke up that morning to the knock I dreaded most, sharp, cold, unyielding. But nothing prepared me for the words my own daughter said as she handed me an eviction notice. "Mom, you have to leave by tonight." The ground beneath my feet felt like it was crumbling, taking with it every sacrifice I'd ever made for her. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and for 73 years, I've called the Bronx home. The apartment where I raised my children sits on the third floor of a pre-war building on Morris Avenue, where the constant hum of traffic mingles with the distant wail of sirens that have become the soundtrack to my life. The walls, yellowed with decades of cigarette smoke from the previous tenant and tired memories from years of my own struggles, held everything I'd ever known about love, loss, and survival. My mornings always started the same way. At 5:30 sharp, I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my threadbare slippers, the ones with holes near the big toes that I kept promising myself I'd replace. I'd brew coffee so black it could strip paint, using the same chipped mug my late husband Thomas gave me 30 years ago. The handle was cracked, held together with super glue that had yellowed with age, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. Some mornings, I'd catch myself talking to it as if Thomas was still there, listening to my worries about the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to multiply overnight on my kitchen table. The only life I managed to nurture in that cramped space was my collection of potted plants by the window. A spider plant that had grown wild and unruly, its babies dangling like green tears. A stubborn African violet that bloomed purple despite the lack of proper sunlight. These plants were my companions, witnesses to the loneliness that had slowly consumed my days. They never asked for money, never ignored my calls, never made me feel like a burden. That Tuesday morning in March, the brittle scent of damp newspapers and something else, something that smelled like defeat, felt heavier than usual. I clutched the eviction notice with trembling fingers, reading the words over and over as if repetition might change their meaning. 48 hours. That's all she was giving me to pack up a lifetime and disappear from the place I'd called home for 27 years. My daughter Linda's voice echoed in the hallway outside my door, cold as the winter wind that still rattled the window panes even though spring was supposed to be coming. She was talking to someone on the phone, probably her husband, probably about me. "It's better this way," I heard her say. "She needs to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 73, apparently I still had lessons to learn about independence from the daughter I'd supported for 45 years. Just the night before, I had sent her a message asking if I could come over for dinner. A simple request from a lonely mother to her only daughter. The message was marked as read at 7:43 p.m. No response. Just the crushing silence that had become her standard reply to any attempt I made at connection. I stared at my phone screen until my eyes burned, hoping the 3 dots that indicated she was typing would appear. They never did. I walked to my bedroom wall, where faded photographs hung in mismatched frames I'd collected from garage sales over the years. There was Linda at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the birthday cake I'd made from scratch because we couldn't afford a bakery cake. The scent of vanilla and the memory of her squealing with delight when she saw the lopsided pink roses I'd piped with my shaking hands. Another photo from Christmas 5 years ago, the last time our family felt whole. We were gathered around my small artificial tree, the one with half the lights burned out, and Linda was actually smiling. Really smiling, not the tight-lipped expression she wore now whenever she looked at me. The bitter contrast between those memories and my current reality hit me like a physical blow. When had I become the enemy? When had my presence become such a burden that my own child would rather see me homeless than share a meal with me? I remember when Linda was 8 years old and I was juggling 2 jobs just to keep us afloat after Thomas died. The morning shift at Martinez Deli on 3rd Avenue, where I'd slice cold cuts and ring up coffee for construction workers and nurses heading to their own thankless jobs. My hands would smell like pastrami and pickle brine for hours afterward, but I didn't mind. It was honest work, and Mrs. Martinez was kind to me, sometimes letting me take home day-old sandwiches for Linda's lunch. The evenings belonged to Global Cleaning Services. I'd take the subway downtown to Manhattan, where I'd spend 4 hours scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans in corporate offices that smelled like expensive coffee and disappointment. The fluorescent lights would buzz overhead as I worked alone, my reflection distorted in the polished surfaces I cleaned. I'd imagine the lives of the people who worked at those desks during the day, their family photos, their potted succulents, their post-it notes reminding them of meetings and deadlines. Did they know that a widow from the Bronx was keeping their world spotless while they slept? All of it was for Linda. Every blister on my feet from standing for 12 hours, every ache in my back from bending and reaching, every moment of exhaustion that left me too tired to eat dinner, it was all so she could have ballet lessons at Miss Catherine's dance studio. Mom, you don't have to do this, she'd say when I'd come home at midnight, my uniform stained with bleach and my hands raw from chemicals. She was 12 then, old enough to understand that other kids' mothers didn't disappear for 14 hours a day. But she was also old enough to know that her pink tights and satin shoes didn't pay for themselves, that her Tuesday and Thursday lessons were the reason I lived on crackers and peanut butter while she ate actual meals. I'm fine, sweetheart, I'd whisper, kissing her forehead. Did you practice your positions today? I'd ask this even though I was swaying on my feet, even though my vision was blurry with fatigue. Her happiness was worth more than my comfort. At least, I thought it was then. The pattern continued through high school. When Linda announced she wanted to go to college, not just any college, but Columbia University, I didn't tell her we couldn't afford it. Instead, I found a third job. Weekend catering with a company that did events for wealthy families in Manhattan. I'd serve champagne to people who spent more on their shoes than I made in a month, invisible in my black uniform as they celebrated milestones I could only dream of. One Thanksgiving, 2 months into her freshman year, Linda called me crying. Mom, they're going to kick me out if I don't pay the housing fee by Friday. It's $800. I'm so sorry, I should have told you sooner, but I thought the financial aid would cover everything. I looked at the rent money sitting on my kitchen counter. $750 in 20s and 10s, saved from tips and overtime hours. My landlord, Mr. Rodriguez, had already warned me about late payments. But Linda's voice was so small, so scared. She was my baby, alone in that big university with all those rich kids who belonged there in ways she never would. Don't worry, honey. Mama's got this. I took the subway to Columbia that Wednesday before Thanksgiving and handed her my rent money in a manila envelope. This should cover it and give you a little extra for groceries. Her smile when she hugged me was worth the 3 weeks I spent sleeping on my friend Rosa's couch while I waited for my next paycheck. Rosa lived in a studio apartment in Washington Heights, and her sofa had springs that poked through the worn upholstery, but she never made me feel like a burden. She'd make café con leche in the mornings and we'd sit by her window, watching the Hudson River catch the early sunlight. Mija, why don't you tell Linda you need help too? Rosa would ask. She's grown now. She should know what you sacrifice. But I couldn't. Linda was thriving at Columbia, making friends from families with summer houses and trust funds. She was becoming something I never could be: educated, sophisticated, confident. The last thing I wanted was for her to feel guilty about her mother's struggles. I wanted her to soar, not look back. After college, Linda got a job at a nonprofit in Manhattan. The money wasn't great, but it was respectable work, the kind of job where she wore blazers and carried a leather briefcase. She met David at a networking event, a finance guy with an MBA and a family from Connecticut who owned a house with actual guest rooms. Plural. When they got engaged, I offered to help pay for the wedding. Mom, that's really sweet, but we've got it handled, Linda said, but I could hear the stress in her voice. David's parents were contributing $20,000. I had $800 in my savings account and a burning desire to not let my daughter feel lesser on her wedding day. I took out a loan against my 401k. $4,500 that I'd been saving since Thomas died, money I'd planned to use for my own retirement someday. I wrote Linda a check and watched her face light up with relief. Mom, are you sure? This is too much. Nothing's too much for my baby's happiness, I told her. And I meant it. Even now, sitting in my apartment with an eviction notice in my hands, I meant it. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifices stopped being appreciated and started being expected. The thank you calls became shorter. The invitations to family events became rarer. The requests for money became more frequent and more urgent. Mom, David's brother is getting married and we need to buy a gift. Something nice, you know? His family has expectations. $500. Mom, we want to take a vacation for our anniversary, but money's tight with the new apartment. Could you help us out? $1,200. Mom, my laptop died and I need a new one for work. This one's perfect, but it's more than we budgeted for. $800. Each time, I said yes. Each time, I watched my small savings account shrink while telling myself that this was what love looked like. Parents helped their children. That's what families did. The promises to pay me back came with every request. You'll get it back as soon as my next freelance check comes in. We'll pay you back over the next few months, I promise. Mom, you know we're good for it. But the checks never came. The payments never materialized. And slowly, I began to feel like an ATM with a pulse, useful when needed, ignored when not. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the way Linda started talking to me. The impatience in her voice when I called to check in. The eye rolls when I'd share stories about my day. The way she'd cut me off mid-sentence to take calls from friends or David, as if my words had an expiration date that theirs didn't. "Mom, I'm kinda busy right now," became her standard greeting. "Can we talk later?" Later never came. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was calling too much. Maybe my stories about Mrs. Martinez's grandson or Rosa's arthritis were boring. Maybe I was becoming one of those needy elderly mothers I'd always pitied in movies, clinging, desperate, embarrassing. So I called less, visited less, asked for less. But instead of making things better, my withdrawal seemed to make Linda more irritated with me, not less. Now when we did talk, there was an edge to her voice, a sharpness that cut through any pretense of affection. "Why'd you send me that article, Mom?" she snapped one day when I'd forwarded her a piece about mother-daughter relationships I'd found online. I thought it was sweet, about the importance of family bonds. She clearly disagreed. "I don't have time to read random stuff you find on the internet." The chill in her voice was colder than any New York winter I'd endured. I mumbled an apology and promised not to send anything else. But the damage was done. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing which word or gesture would trigger her impatience. David's silence was almost worse than Linda's hostility. He'd sit at my kitchen table during their rare visits, scrolling through his phone while Linda and I talked. When I'd ask him questions about his work or his family, he'd give one-word answers without looking up. His presence was a void that sucked the warmth out of whatever fragile connection Linda and I still had. I started to wonder if I was just a wallet to them. A convenient source of emergency funds and free emotional labor. The question haunted me, especially during the long hours when I couldn't sleep, lying in my bed listening to the neighbors argue through the thin walls. Was this what I'd worked so hard for? Was this the relationship I'd sacrificed everything to build? The realization came slowly, then all at once. Like watching the sunrise, you don't notice the sky changing until suddenly it's day and you can see everything clearly, including the things you'd rather not see. It started with small things. Ignored text messages on my birthday. A Mother's Day that passed without acknowledgement until I mentioned it, only to receive a hastily purchased card with David's name on it too, even though I'd never met him until Linda was already engaged. Christmas gifts that felt like afterthoughts, drugstore candles, generic scarves, gift cards to restaurants I couldn't afford to eat at even with their contribution. Then came the bigger slights. The dinner party Linda threw for David's promotion that I learned about through Rosa, whose daughter worked with someone who knew someone who was there. Why wasn't I invited? I asked Linda when I finally worked up the courage to call her about it. "It was just work people, Mom. You would have been bored." But I saw the photos on Facebook before Linda's privacy settings kicked in. Her college friends were there. David's brother and sister-in-law. Even some neighbors from their building. Everyone except the woman who'd made their life possible. The day I got pneumonia was my breaking point, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I'd been feeling sick for a week, tired, coughing, running a fever that I kept treating with over-the-counter medicine and sheer stubbornness. I couldn't afford to miss work, and I certainly couldn't afford a doctor's visit. But Tuesday morning, I woke up on Rosa's bathroom floor. I'd gotten up to use the toilet and collapsed, my lungs on fire and my vision spinning like a carnival ride. Rosa found me there an hour later, unconscious and burning with fever. The ambulance ride to Bronx Lebanon Hospital was a blur of sirens and concerned voices speaking in medical jargon I didn't understand. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and fear, filled with people who looked like me, tired, worried, uninsured or underinsured, hoping that whatever was wrong with them could be fixed without bankrupting them. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Both lungs. Probably walking around with it for weeks. I needed to be admitted, needed 4 antibiotics, needed rest and monitoring. I also needed someone to call, someone to sit with me through the scary parts, someone to care that I was alone in a hospital bed watching my oxygen levels on a machine I didn't understand. I called Linda from my hospital bed, my voice barely a whisper. "Honey, I'm at Bronx Lebanon. I have pneumonia. Could you come sit with me for a little while?" The pause before she answered was long enough for my heart to sink. "Mom, I'm really swamped at work this week. David's out of town and I have this huge project due. Are you okay? Like, are you going to be okay? Going to be okay." As if my recovery was a foregone conclusion, as if hospitals were places where old women went to rest comfortably, not places where they sometimes died alone. "I think so," I whispered. "It's just, I'm scared. Could you maybe stop by tomorrow?" Another pause. "I'll try. Text me the room number." She never came. For 4 days, I lay in that hospital bed, watching other patients receive visitors, children with balloons, spouses with homemade soup, friends with magazines and gossip. The nurses were kind, especially Maria, a young woman from Puerto Rico who reminded me of Linda at that age. She'd sit with me during her breaks, telling me about her own mother back in San Juan. Your daughter must be worried sick, Maria said, adjusting my fore. When my mama was in the hospital, I practically lived here. I just smiled and changed the subject. What could I say? That my daughter was too busy to visit her hospitalized mother? That I was learning what it felt like to be expendable in my own family? On the day I was discharged, I took a taxi home alone. $43 I couldn't afford, but I was too weak to navigate the subway with my discharge papers and the antibiotic prescriptions I'd need to fill. Linda texted me later that evening, glad you're feeling better. Sorry I couldn't make it by. Crazy week. Feeling better. As if pneumonia was like a common cold, something you bounced back from quickly. I wanted to text back, I wasn't feeling better. I was dying. And you weren't there. Instead, I wrote, no worries, honey. I understand. But I was beginning not to understand. Or maybe I was beginning to understand too much. The real revelation came 2 months later when I was sorting through my mail. Bills, mostly, Con Edison, hospital payments, credit card statements from the money I'd borrowed to help Linda with various emergencies over the years. But there, mixed in with the usual suspects, was something that didn't belong, a credit card statement with Linda's name on it. It had been delivered to my address by mistake. The obvious thing to do was drop it in an envelope and forward it to her. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she'd been avoiding my calls lately, or the curtness of our last conversation, or just the bitter taste that had been growing in my mouth every time I thought about our relationship. I opened it. I told myself I was just checking for important information, something urgent she might need to know about. But what I found was worse than any financial emergency. Charges from restaurants I couldn't pronounce, stores I'd never heard of, vacation resorts that cost more per night than I made in a month. She'd been living a life of luxury while borrowing money from me to cover basic expenses. The vacation she'd asked me to help fund? She'd actually spent 3 times what I'd given her, staying at places that had spa services and private beaches. But the detail that made my hands shake wasn't the frivolous spending. It was a charge from November, a jewelry store purchase for $1,200, made the same week she'd called me crying about not being able to afford her electric bill. I'd sent her $300 from my grocery money, eating crackers and peanut butter for 2 weeks while she purchased what was probably a bracelet worth more than my monthly Social Security check. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that statement until the numbers blurred together. All those years of sacrifice, all those double shifts and skipped meals, all those nights spent worrying about her financial stability, and she was living better than I ever had. She wasn't struggling, she was shopping. She wasn't in crisis, she was enjoying luxuries I couldn't imagine having. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in my chest, pressing down until I couldn't breathe properly. I'd been played. Manipulated. Used. The daughter I'd raised, the girl I'd given everything for, saw me as nothing more than a source of free money to fund her lifestyle upgrades. I don't know how long I sat there, holding that credit card statement like evidence in a trial I never knew I was part of. But when I finally stood up, something had shifted inside me. The unconditional love was still there, I don't think that ever goes away when you're a mother. But the willingness to be destroyed by it was gone. I walked to my kitchen sink and turned on the tap, watching the water swirl down the drain. Then I picked up the ceramic mug Thomas had given me, the one with the cracked handle held together by yellowed glue, the one I'd been drinking from for 30 years because it connected me to happier times. I held it up to the light, seeing all its flaws, all the places where it had been broken and mended and broken again. And then I let it fall. The crash was loud in the silence of my apartment, the sound of something precious being destroyed beyond repair. Pieces of ceramic scattered across my linoleum floor, some large chunks, some tiny fragments that would probably turn up under my refrigerator months later. I knelt down among the pieces, my arthritic knees protesting against the hard floor, and I cried. But they weren't just tears of grief. Mixed in with the sadness was something else, relief. I'd been holding on to that mug the way I'd been holding on to the idea of Linda as the grateful daughter I'd raised. Both were broken. Both had been broken for a long time. Maybe it was time to stop pretending I could keep putting the pieces back together. I swept up the fragments and threw them in the trash. Then I washed my hands, made coffee in a different cup, and thought about what I was going to do next. For the first time in decades, I didn't know. For the first time in decades, that felt like freedom instead of fear. But freedom, I was about to learn, comes with a price. And sometimes the people you love most are the least willing to let you pay it. The next morning, Linda called. Not to check on me, not to apologize for missing my hospitalization, not to acknowledge the credit card statement that was probably missing from her mail. She called because she needed money. Look, I need a favor. David's car broke down and we need to get it fixed before his job interview Thursday. It's $800, but it's really important. His career could depend on this. I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, staring at it like it was an alien artifact. $800. Again. Always with a deadline, always with high stakes, always with the implication that saying no would be selfish, short-sighted, cruel. Linda, I said slowly, I saw your credit card statement. The one that was delivered here by mistake. Silence on the other end. Then, you opened my mail? I was trying to forward it to you. That's a federal offense, Mom. You can't just. You spent $1,200 on jewelry the same week you told me you couldn't afford your electric bill. More silence. Then, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, cold and sharp as winter wind, how I spend my money is none of your business. It becomes my business when you're spending it with money I lend you. Lend? Mom, you've never asked me to pay you back before. I thought that money was. I thought you were just helping family. Just helping family. As if helping meant giving until there was nothing left, as if family meant never questioning where the help went or whether it was actually needed. I was helping family, I said. But I think I've been helping the wrong person. What's that supposed to mean? It means I can't give you $800 for David's car. It means I can't keep giving you money at all. The pause that followed was so long I thought she'd hung up. Then, are you serious right now? After everything David and I have done for you? Everything they'd done for me. I looked around my cramped apartment, at the stack of unpaid bills, at the empty space where my favorite mug used to sit, at the photos on the wall of better times that felt like lies now. What exactly have you done for me, Linda? We visit you. We invite you to things. We put up with your. She stopped herself, but not soon enough. My what? Nothing. Forget it. Look, if you can't help us, fine. But don't act like we don't care about you, because that's not fair. Put up with. The phrase echoed in my mind long after she hung up. She didn't love me, she tolerated me. I wasn't her mother, I was her burden. And apparently, I was a burden who was expected to pay for the privilege of being tolerated. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my building settling into sleep. Mrs. Chen upstairs running water for her evening tea. The young couple next door arguing about whose turn it was to walk the dog. Normal sounds from normal lives where people's worth wasn't measured by their willingness to bankrupt themselves for others. I thought about calling Rosa, but it was late and she had work in the morning. I thought about calling my son Michael in California, but we'd drifted apart over the years and I wasn't sure he'd understand. Linda had always been his little sister, the baby of the family who could do no wrong. Would he believe that his sweet sister was capable of financial manipulation? Would he believe that his mother wasn't just being dramatic? Instead, I got up and made myself a cup of tea, in a new mug I'd bought at the bodega down the street, plain white ceramic without any sentimental value or emotional baggage. I sat by my kitchen window, looking out at the street lights creating pools of yellow on the empty sidewalk, and made a decision that would change everything. I was done being an ATM with feelings. I was done apologizing for my existence. I was done begging for scraps of attention from people who saw me as an inconvenience. At 73 years old, I was going to learn how to say no. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, Linda called again. This time, she skipped the pleasantries entirely. Mom, we really need that money for David's car. His interview is tomorrow and he can't get there without it. Please. I'm begging you. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. No. What? No. I can't give you money for David's car. Can't or won't. Both. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Then Linda's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it. Fine. I hope you enjoy being alone, Mom. Because that's where this attitude is going to get you. She hung up. I sat holding the phone until the dial tone stopped, until there was nothing but silence filling my apartment like floodwater. And then I realized something that should have terrified me. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of being used. The threats started the next week. Not physical threats, Linda was too sophisticated for that, but emotional and financial ones that cut just as deep. First came the guilt. I told David what you said, Mom. He's really hurt. He always thought you liked him. He's wondering if you've ever actually cared about our family at all. Then came the leverage. I guess I shouldn't expect you to want to see your grandchildren anymore, since you've made it clear that money is more important to you than helping your own daughter. Finally came the isolation. Michael thinks you're losing it, Mom. I told him about the credit card thing and how you're suddenly being weird about money. He's concerned about your mental state. Each call was designed to make me doubt myself, to make me believe that setting boundaries was the same as being selfish, that protecting myself was the same as abandoning my family. For a week, it almost worked. I lay awake at night wondering if I was being too harsh, too stubborn, too unforgiving. Maybe Linda was right. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. But then I remembered the hospital. For days of lying there alone, scared and sick, while my daughter was too busy to visit. I remembered the credit card statement, the evidence of a life funded by my sacrifice while I ate crackers for dinner. I remembered her voice on the phone. Put up with your, what had she been about to say? Put up with my what? My neediness? My age? My existence? The answer came 2 weeks later, in the form of an eviction notice slipped under my door while I was out getting groceries. I stared at the official paper, reading the words over and over until they made sense. Failure to pay rent. 30 days to vacate. Legal action would be taken if I didn't comply. But I had paid my rent. I always paid my rent, even when it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for a week, even when it meant skipping my blood pressure medication to save money. I had the receipts, the money order stubs, the confirmation emails from my online banking. I called my landlord, Mr. Rodriguez, a decent man who'd never given me trouble in 27 years of tenancy. Miguel, there's been some mistake. I got an eviction notice, but I paid rent last week. Margaret, I'm sorry, but you're 3 months behind. I tried to work with you, but I can't carry the debt anymore. I have bills too. 3 months behind? That was impossible. I pulled out my checkbook register, my bank statements, my carefully organized file of receipts. Everything showed regular payments, on time, every month. Miguel, can you check your records again? I have proof that Margaret. His voice was gentle but firm. The checks have been bouncing. 3 months in a row. Your bank called it insufficient funds. My hands started shaking. Insufficient funds? I'd been checking my balance religiously, making sure there was enough to cover rent plus a small cushion. How could there be insufficient funds? I hung up and called my bank immediately, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After 20 minutes on hold listening to music that made me want to scream, I finally reached a human being who could access my account. Ma'am, I'm showing several large withdrawals over the past 3 months. ATM withdrawals, mostly, some online transfers. The account has been overdrawn repeatedly. That's impossible. I haven't made any large withdrawals. I don't even use ATMs. The withdrawals were made with your debit card, ma'am. In Manhattan, mostly. Some online purchases as well. Manhattan. Where Linda worked. Where she often met friends for lunch and shopping trips. Where she probably felt safe using an ATM she assumed I'd never check. Can you tell me the exact dates and amounts? As the bank representative read off the transactions, my stomach sank deeper with each one. 200 here, 300 there. Online purchases from stores I'd never heard of. Cash withdrawals made while I was home in the Bronx, unaware that my account was being drained. Ma'am, is it possible someone else has access to your debit card? Someone else. My daughter, who'd asked to borrow it just once 6 months ago when her own card was being replaced and she needed to buy groceries. I'd given it to her along with my PIN, trusting her completely. She'd returned it the next day, thanking me for helping her out of a jam. But apparently, she'd never really returned it. She'd copied the information, memorized the numbers, kept access to the account long after I thought she'd given it back. Ma'am? Are you still there? Yes, I whispered. I need to report fraudulent activity on my account. I'll transfer you to our fraud department. But ma'am, I have to warn you, if this was done by a family member with your permission to use the card initially, it might be difficult to prove fraud legally. Difficult to prove fraud. Because I'd trusted my own daughter. Because love had made me vulnerable to the person who should have protected me most. By the time I finished with the bank, my account was frozen pending investigation, my debit card was canceled, and I had $17 in cash to my name. $17 and an eviction notice giving me 30 days to find a new place to live. I called Linda immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. Linda, we need to talk. Right now. Mom, I'm at work. Can this wait? No, it cannot wait. You've been stealing money from my account. The pause was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, that's a very serious accusation, Mom. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. The bank has records of ATM withdrawals in Manhattan made with my debit card while I was home in the Bronx. I don't know what you're talking about. Linda, don't lie to me. I trusted you with my card 6 months ago and you've been using it ever since. You've stolen over $2,000 from me. My rent checks have been bouncing because of you. Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was different, colder, more calculating. Prove it. What? Prove it was me. Prove I stole anything. You gave me permission to use your card, remember? You said I could use it whenever I needed to help the family. I was just helping the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was twisting my trust into consent, my love into permission to rob me blind. I never said you could keep using it. I never said you could take money whenever you wanted. That's not how I remember it, Mom. And I think if we asked David, or Michael, or anyone else, they'd remember you being pretty generous with your offers to help family financially. Maybe you just forgot giving me permission. Memory problems are pretty common at your age. At my age. She was gaslighting me, making me question my own memories, my own sanity. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep, the teenager I'd stayed up waiting for when she missed curfew, the young woman I'd been so proud of when she graduated college. And she was destroying me systematically, methodically, without remorse. Linda, I'm going to be evicted because of this. I have nowhere to go. That's really unfortunate, Mom. Maybe you should have managed your money better. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by 27 years of memories, and felt something inside me break apart completely. Not like the mug I'd dropped, that had been a clean break, sharp but definitive. This was different. This was the slow dissolution of everything I'd believed about love, family, and the basic decency of the people I'd sacrificed everything for. But as I sat there, something else began to form in the space where my illusions used to be. It was unfamiliar, this new feeling. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger. Not the guilt-ridden, second-guessing kind of anger I usually felt when Linda hurt me. This was different. This was the anger of someone who'd finally seen the truth clearly and decided they'd had enough. I picked up the phone and called the bank back. I want to file a police report for financial elder abuse, I said. My voice was steady now, calm in a way it hadn't been for months. Ma'am, I should warn you, if this involves a family member, I understand. But stealing is stealing, regardless of genetics. Next, I called a lawyer. Rose's nephew worked at a legal aid office in Manhattan that helped elderly people with financial abuse cases. It would take time, he warned me. The court system moved slowly, and family cases were complicated. But it was possible to recover at least some of what Linda had taken, and more importantly, it would create a legal record of what she'd done. Then I did something I should have done years ago. I opened a new bank account at a small credit union in my neighborhood, one where Linda would never think to look, one where my money would be safe from people who saw my love as weakness and my trust as stupidity. But my immediate problem remained. I had $17 and 28 days to find somewhere to live. That's when Rosa knocked on my door. Mija, Mrs. Chen upstairs told me she saw you crying in the hallway. What's wrong? I showed her the eviction notice, told her about the bank account, explained about Linda's betrayal in a voice that only shook a little. Rosa listened without judgment, her weathered hands holding mine while I talked. You can stay with me, she said immediately. For as long as you need. Rosa, I can't. Your place is tiny, and you have your own problems. My problems don't include being homeless because my daughter is a thief. You're staying with me, and that's final. We'll figure out the rest later. I cried then, but they were different tears. Grateful tears. Tears of relief at discovering that kindness still existed in the world, that not everyone saw me as something to be used and discarded. But Rosa's generosity solved only one problem. Linda still had my bank information from before I'd closed the account. She still had access to other aspects of my life, my addresses, my social security number, my medical information. She knew where I banked, where I shopped, who my friends were. In her anger at being cut off financially, she might decide to cause even more damage. I was right to be worried. 2 weeks later, living on Rosa's couch and slowly piecing my life back together, I got a call from the Social Security Administration. Someone had called claiming to be me, trying to change my direct deposit information and mailing address. The only thing that stopped the change from going through was a security question about my mother's maiden name, information Linda didn't have. Then came a call from my doctor's office. Someone had called requesting my medical records, claiming to be my daughter who was concerned about my mental health and needed the information to help me get appropriate care. The receptionist, thank God, knew me well enough to call and verify before releasing anything. Finally, I got a call from my insurance company. Someone had tried to add themselves as an authorized user on my policy, claiming to be my medical power of attorney. They'd been turned away because the paperwork wasn't properly notarized, but it was clear what Linda was trying to do. She was systematically trying to take control of my life, my money, my medical decisions, my identity. If she couldn't have access to my bank account, she'd find other ways to maintain power over me. Other ways to ensure I remained dependent, manageable, exploitable. I realized then that the financial abuse had never been about the money itself. It was about control. It was about keeping me in a position where I needed her approval, her help, her presence in my life. As long as I was financially dependent and emotionally desperate, I'd never question her treatment of me. I'd never set boundaries. I'd never say no. But I'd already said no. And now she was trying to take away my ability to make that choice stick. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning in November. Rosa and I were having coffee by her window, watching the early commuters hurry toward the subway station, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made me answer it. "Is this Margaret Sullivan?" "Yes. This is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. We've received a report that you're missing and possibly in danger. Your daughter called us, very concerned. She says you haven't been answering your phone and she's worried about your mental state." I looked at my phone. 17 missed calls from Linda over the past 2 days. I'd been ignoring them, finally at peace enough to not jump every time she demanded my attention. "I'm not missing, Detective. I'm staying with a friend. Your daughter seems to think you might be confused, possibly suffering from dementia. She's requesting a wellness check. We'd like to send an officer by to make sure you're okay." A wellness check. Linda was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, probably as a first step toward gaining legal guardianship. If she couldn't control my money directly, she'd have me declared unfit to control it myself. "Detective Martinez, I'm 73 years old, not 93. I'm living with my friend Rosa Gutierrez in Washington Heights because my daughter stole money from my bank account and I couldn't afford my rent. I have a lawyer working on the financial abuse case. I'm not missing, and I'm not confused. I'm protecting myself." The silence on the other end was telling. "Ma'am, can you give me your current address so we can verify your well-being?" I gave him Rosa's address and phone number. Within an hour, a uniformed officer was at the door, a young woman who looked barely old enough to be out of the academy, with kind eyes and a patient manner. "Mrs. Sullivan? I'm Officer Chen. I just need to check that you're safe and make my report. Your daughter sounded very worried on the phone." "Officer Chen, my daughter is worried that I've cut off her access to my bank account. She's been systematically stealing from me for months, and now she's trying to have me declared incompetent so she can regain control of my finances." I showed her the documentation I'd gathered, bank statements, the lawyer's business card, receipts showing Linda's fraudulent withdrawals. I explained about the eviction, the attempts to change my social security information, the medical records requests. Officer Chen took notes, asked clear, direct questions, and treated me like a competent adult rather than a confused elderly person who needed to be handled with kid gloves. "Mrs. Sullivan, have you been evaluated by a medical professional recently? I ask only because if there's any question of your mental competency, it needs to be addressed properly. I saw my doctor last month for my regular checkup. Dr. Patel at Bronx Family Medical. He can verify that I'm mentally sharp. I also have a lawyer working on this case if you need professional verification." Officer Chen nodded and made more notes. "I'm going to file a report stating that you're safe, mentally competent, and living voluntarily with a friend. I'm also going to include information about the financial abuse allegations. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to file a formal complaint." After she left, I sat on Rosa's couch feeling exhausted but oddly victorious. Linda had overplayed her hand. Her attempt to have me declared incompetent had backfired, creating an official record of my mental competency and her manipulative behavior. But I knew this wasn't over. Linda was desperate now, backed into a corner by her own greed and my unexpected resistance. Desperate people do desperate things, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. What came next was worse than I imagined. 3 days later, Rosa came home from work with a strange expression on her face. "Mija, my supervisor asked me some weird questions today. Someone called the school where I work, asking about you. They said they were concerned about my judgment in letting a mentally unstable elderly person stay in my home, especially since I work with children." My blood ran cold. Linda was trying to get Rosa in trouble at work, potentially threatening her job as a teacher's aide at a local elementary school. She was attacking the one person who'd shown me unconditional kindness, trying to isolate me by making my presence a liability for anyone who helped me. "Rosa, I'm so sorry. I'll leave right away. I won't let her destroy your job because of me. Don't you dare." Rosa's voice was fierce, protective. "That girl is evil, Margarita. Pure evil. You're staying right here, and if she wants to fight, we'll fight." But I couldn't let Rosa suffer for my family problems. I couldn't let Linda's cruelty spread to innocent people who'd done nothing but show me kindness. That night, lying on Rosa's couch listening to her gentle snoring from the bedroom, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop running, stop hiding, stop trying to minimize the damage Linda could do. I was going to fight back. Not with manipulation or emotional blackmail, the weapons she'd used against me for so long. I was going to fight with something she'd never expected from me, the truth. The next morning, I called Michael in California. Mom? Is everything okay? Linda said you've been struggling lately. Of course she had. Linda was probably working on turning my son against me too, poisoning him with lies about my mental state and unreasonable behavior. Michael, I need to tell you some things about your sister. Things you probably won't want to hear. I told him everything. The financial abuse, the stolen money, the attempts to take control of my medical information, the false report to the police, the attack on Rose's employment. I spoke calmly, sticking to facts, providing dates and documentation when possible. Michael was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then, Mom, this doesn't sound like Linda. Are you sure you're not what? Not remembering correctly? Not seeing the situation clearly? Michael, your sister tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my finances. She's been stealing from me for months. These aren't opinions or interpretations. They're facts. But why would she do that? She makes decent money. She and David are doing fine. Are they, Michael? Or are they living beyond their means and using me as their personal bank? When was the last time you actually looked at their lifestyle versus their income? Another long pause. Michael was an accountant, trained to see financial patterns and discrepancies. I could almost hear him running numbers in his head. Mom, even if what you're saying is true, she's still your daughter. She's still my sister. Family doesn't give up on family. And what about family not stealing from family? What about family not trying to have family declared incompetent? What about family not attacking innocent people who show kindness to family? Maybe she's just scared, Mom. Maybe she thinks she's protecting you from something. Protecting me. From what? From having control over my own life? From making my own decisions about my money and my relationships? Michael, I need you to choose. Either you believe me, or you believe her. But you can't believe both of us, because our stories are completely different. I don't want to have to choose between my mother and my sister. But that's exactly what Linda had forced him to do. By lying, by manipulating, by trying to destroy my credibility, she'd created a situation where neutrality was impossible. Then I'll make the choice easier for you, I said. Don't choose. But don't expect me to pretend this didn't happen. Don't expect me to play happy family with someone who tried to have me declared incompetent. Don't expect me to forgive financial abuse just because we share DNA. I hung up before he could respond. It felt like closing a door that might never open again, but I was tired of being diplomatic about my own destruction. That afternoon, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I called Linda directly. She answered on the second ring, her voice artificially bright. Mom, I've been so worried about you. Where have you been staying? Are you okay? I'm staying with Rosa Gutierrez in Washington Heights, and you know that because you tried to get her fired from her job. The artificial brightness dropped immediately. I don't know what you're talking about. Linda, we're past pretending. You stole money from my bank account. You tried to take control of my medical records. You filed a false missing person report. You called Rosa's employer trying to get her in trouble. And now you've been lying to Michael about my mental state. Mom, you're being paranoid. No one is trying to hurt you, stop. Just stop. I'm not calling to argue with you or to give you another chance to manipulate me. I'm calling to tell you that it's over. Whatever relationship we had, whatever family connection we pretended to maintain, it's finished. You don't mean that. I mean every word. You've shown me who you are, Linda. You're someone who steals from her mother. You're someone who tries to have her mother declared incompetent out of spite. You're someone who attacks innocent people to get revenge. That's not my daughter. My daughter died a long time ago, and I just took too long to notice. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of hurt and disappointment and the final collapse of any pretense of love. You'll regret this, Linda said finally. When you're old and sick and need help, remember that you chose pride over family. When I'm old and sick, I'll remember that I chose self-respect over being destroyed by people who called themselves family. I hung up and immediately blocked her number, blocked her on social media, blocked every avenue she'd used to intrude on my peace. Then I sat on Rose's couch and cried, not from sadness this time, but from relief. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the constant anxiety about Linda's next demand or manipulation, was gone. In its place was something I hadn't felt in years, freedom. But Linda had one more card to play. 2 days later, I was walking home from the grocery store when a car pulled up beside me. David got out, looking uncomfortable but determined. Margaret, we need to talk. We have nothing to talk about, David. Linda is devastated. She's been crying for days. She says you've accused her of stealing and cut off all contact. This is tearing our family apart. I looked at this man who'd sat at my kitchen table dozens of times, who'd eaten meals I'd prepared, who'd accepted money I'd struggled to provide, and who'd never once looked me in the eye or thanked me for anything. Your family was torn apart the day Linda decided to steal from me. Your family was torn apart when she chose money over basic human decency. Your family was torn apart when she tried to have me declared incompetent. I didn't tear anything apart. I just stopped pretending it was still together. She made mistakes, okay? She admits that. But she's learned from them. She wants to make things right. What does making things right look like, David? Does it include paying back the money she stole? Does it include apologizing for the false police report? Does it include taking responsibility for attacking Rosa's employment? David shifted uncomfortably. Money can be repaid. Apologies can be made. But if you cut her off completely, none of that can happen. Money can be repaid, but it hasn't been. Apologies can be made, but they haven't been. David, your wife tried to destroy my life systematically and methodically. The only reason she wants to make things right now is because she's facing consequences for the first time. She's pregnant. The words hit me like a physical blow. Linda was pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother again, and my grandchild would grow up without knowing me because of this war between Linda and me. For a moment, the old guilt tried to resurface. Maybe I should forgive her for the sake of the baby. Maybe being a grandmother was more important than being right. Maybe family really was everything, even when family was toxic and destructive. But then I thought about that hypothetical grandchild growing up with Linda as a mother. Growing up learning that love could be bought, that family members existed to be used, that manipulation was an acceptable way to get what you wanted. Growing up thinking that it was normal to steal from elderly relatives, to lie to authorities, to attack innocent people out of spite. Congratulations on your pregnancy, I said calmly. I hope you're both very happy. That's it? That's all you have to say? What did you expect, David? That I'd forget everything Linda has done because she's having a baby? That I'd let her back into my life so she can start teaching my grandchild that it's okay to abuse elderly people? You're being ridiculous. I'm being realistic. Linda has shown me exactly who she is. I believe her. And I won't expose myself to more abuse just because she's reproduced. David got back in his car and drove away without another word. I continued walking home, carrying my groceries and carrying the weight of another door closing. That night, Rosa and I sat on her small balcony, looking out over the lights of Manhattan in the distance. The city seemed full of possibility from this height, full of lives being lived by people who might also be struggling with family, money, loneliness, hard choices. Do you think I'm being too harsh? I asked her. Mija, there's a difference between being harsh and being smart. You're being smart. That girl would destroy you if you let her. Pregnancy doesn't change that. But the baby will be fine. And if Linda is half the mother you were, maybe the baby will turn out better than she did. But that's not your responsibility anymore. Rosa was right. I'd spent 45 years taking responsibility for Linda's happiness, Linda's financial security, Linda's life choices. It was time to let her take responsibility for her own child. Over the following weeks, I slowly began to rebuild my life. The lawyer Rosa's nephew had recommended was making progress on the financial abuse case. It would take time, might take years, but there was hope for recovering at least some of what Linda had stolen. More importantly, I was learning how to live for myself. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the local senior center. I joined a book club that met at the library every Thursday. I started taking walks in Fort Tryon Park, remembering what it felt like to move through public spaces without constantly worrying about money or family obligations. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. I stood straighter, spoke more confidently, slept better at night. For the first time in years, I looked forward to waking up instead of dreading what each day might bring. But the real test came in February, for months after I'd cut off contact with Linda. I was leaving the post office after mailing a letter to Michael, a brief note letting him know I was doing well and giving him my new address, when I saw her. Linda was coming out of the CVS next door, visibly pregnant now, maybe 5 or 6 months along. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the width of a New York sidewalk crowded with people going about their ordinary lives. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the stress of being cut off from her personal ATM was wearing on her. I felt nothing. No surge of maternal love, no guilt about the grandchild I'd never know, no desire to rush over and reconcile for the sake of family harmony. Just a calm recognition of someone who'd once been important to me and was now a stranger. Linda took a step toward me, and for a moment I thought she might actually approach, might try one more manipulation or plea for sympathy. But something in my face must have stopped her. I wasn't the same frightened, desperate woman she'd been exploiting for years. I was someone who'd learned to value herself, someone who couldn't be broken by threats or guilt trips anymore. She turned and walked away without speaking. I watched her disappear into the crowd of pedestrians and felt only relief that the encounter was over. That evening, Rosa asked if I was okay after seeing Linda. "I'm more than okay," I told her. "I'm free." Spring came early that year, or maybe it just felt that way because I was finally paying attention to seasons again instead of being consumed by family drama and financial stress. I found a small apartment in Rosa's building, a studio on the second floor that caught morning light and had space for a few plants by the window. The day I moved in, with Rosa's help and a borrowed hand truck from the building superintendent, I realized this was the first place I'd chosen entirely for myself. The apartment on Morris Avenue had been what Thomas and I could afford when we were young and starting a family. This place was what I wanted, small but bright, affordable but comfortable, mine without compromise or consultation with anyone else's needs or preferences. I painted the walls a soft yellow that reminded me of sunlight. I bought furniture from thrift stores and secondhand shops, choosing pieces for comfort and beauty rather than durability for children or practicality for a family. Everything in this apartment was chosen by me, for me, because it made me happy. The first night I slept in my own bed, in my own place, I lay awake not from worry but from wonder. At 73 years old, I was starting over. At 73 years old, I was learning what it meant to live for myself. My days took on a new rhythm. Morning coffee by my window, watching the street wake up below. Afternoons spent reading or painting or walking in the park. Evenings with Rosa, or at the senior center, or sometimes just alone with my thoughts and the satisfaction of solitude chosen rather than imposed. I started volunteering at a local organization that helped elderly people navigate financial abuse cases. My experience with Linda, painful as it had been, gave me insight into the tactics used by family members who prey on their older relatives. I could spot the signs now: the gradual isolation, the emergency requests for money, the guilt trips disguised as expressions of love. Other elderly people sought me out for advice and support. Women who discovered their adult children stealing from them. Men whose families had moved them into nursing homes against their will so they could take control of their assets. People who'd been convinced by their families that raising questions about missing money or unauthorized financial transactions meant they were becoming paranoid and confused. Each story was different, but the pattern was always the same: love weaponized against the person who felt it most deeply. Trust exploited by the people who should have been most trustworthy. Sacrifice punished by the recipients of the sacrifice. But I also met people who'd found their way out, who'd learned to set boundaries and protect themselves without losing their essential humanity. They gave me hope that recovery was possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, that it was never too late to choose self-respect over self-destruction. 6 months into my new life, I did something I'd never imagined I'd have the courage to do. I booked a trip to the Catskills, to a small town called Woodstock where I'd honeymooned with Thomas 47 years earlier. The bus ride took 2 hours through countryside that was green and rolling and peaceful in a way that made my chest feel less tight. I'd made this trip once before, as a young bride full of dreams about the life Thomas and I would build together. Now I was making it as a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most important relationship you can build is the one with yourself. The town had changed, of course. More tourist shops, more expensive restaurants, more people with money to spend on weekend getaways. But the mountains were the same, and the streams still ran clear and cold through the woods where Thomas and I had walked holding hands and talking about our future children. I stayed at a small bed and breakfast run by a woman about my age who'd moved to the area after her own divorce and reinvention. We talked over breakfast about the courage it takes to start over, about the freedom that comes with learning you can survive anything, including the loss of people you'd thought you couldn't live without. I spent 3 days walking mountain trails, painting watercolor landscapes that would never win any awards but captured something true about how the light fell across the leaves. I sat by streams listening to water run over rocks and feeling my mind grow quiet in a way it hadn't for years. On my last evening, I found the restaurant where Thomas and I had celebrated our wedding night. It was still there, though under new management, still serving simple food with windows that looked out over the valley. I ordered wine and the fish special and sat alone at a table for two, feeling not lonely but complete. A young couple at the next table was celebrating their engagement, giddy with possibility and champagne and the certainty that their love would conquer everything life might throw at them. I remembered being that young, that sure of the future, that confident that family would always mean safety and support. I didn't envy them their naivety, but I also didn't pity them for it. They were at the beginning of their story, full of hope and plans and dreams that might or might not survive the tests that marriage and parenthood and aging would bring them. I was in a different chapter of my story, one I was finally getting to write for myself. When I returned to New York, Rosa met me at the bus station with flowers and questions about my trip. As we rode the subway back to Washington Heights, I looked at the reflection of this woman in the train window, gray-haired and wrinkled, wearing clothes chosen for comfort rather than fashion, carrying a small suitcase and a heart that felt lighter than it had in decades. "You look different," Rosa said. "Younger somehow." I felt different. Not younger in years, but younger in possibilities. Younger in the sense of having a future that belonged to me rather than being consumed entirely by obligation to others. That fall brought an unexpected phone call from Michael. "Mom, I owe you an apology." I was stirring soup in my small kitchen, looking out at the first signs of autumn in the tree outside my window. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "You don't owe me anything, Michael." "Yes, I do. I've been doing some thinking about what you told me. About Linda. And I've been paying more attention to things." He paused, and I heard him take a deep breath before continuing. "She asked me for money last month. Said she and David were having trouble with baby expenses and needed help." I started asking questions, detailed questions, the kind I ask clients when I'm reviewing their finances. "Mom, their spending habits don't make sense. They're living way beyond their income," and when I pushed for specifics about where the money was going, Linda got defensive and angry. I waited, letting him work through whatever realization he was approaching. Then yesterday, David calls me. Says Linda is devastated about being cut off from you, says she's having trouble coping with the pregnancy because she's so sad about losing her mother. He asks if I can talk to you about reconciling, for the sake of the family and the new baby. And what did you tell him? I told him I wanted to see their financial records first. I told him that if Linda was really struggling financially, I'd be happy to help, but I needed to understand their situation completely before writing any checks. Michael's voice got quieter, more strained. "Mom, when I said that, David got angry. Really angry. He started talking about how family doesn't interrogate family, how I was being disrespectful and suspicious. He said if I didn't trust them enough to help without conditions, then maybe I wasn't the kind of family member they needed in their lives." I wasn't surprised. David had learned manipulation tactics from Linda, or maybe she'd learned from him. Either way, they'd become a team specializing in emotional blackmail and financial exploitation. "What did you tell him then?" I told him that interrogating finances isn't disrespectful, it's responsible. And that threats to cut me off for asking reasonable questions told me everything I needed to know about their motives. And he hung up on me. Then Linda called an hour later, crying, asking how I could be so cruel to a pregnant woman. She said I was just like you now, cold and heartless and more concerned about money than family. There it was. The pattern Linda had perfected on me, now being deployed against her brother. The manufactured crises, the emotional manipulation, the accusations of coldness when reasonable boundaries were established. "So what are you going to do?" I asked him. "I'm going to start over with both of them. I'm going to stop assuming that DNA means they deserve automatic trust and support. I'm going to start asking the kind of questions I should have been asking all along. And if they don't like those questions? Then I guess I'll learn what you learned, Mom. That sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are actually the people who respect you the least." We talked for another hour, tentatively rebuilding a relationship that Linda's manipulation had nearly destroyed. Michael told me about his work, his life in California, his growing understanding of how unhealthy our family dynamics had become. I told him about my new apartment, my volunteer work, the peace I'd found in choosing myself over people who saw me as an obligation rather than a person. By the time we hung up, something had shifted. Not a complete reconciliation, too much damage had been done for that, but the beginning of something honest built on mutual respect rather than automatic obligation. Winter came again, my first winter in my new apartment, my first winter of real independence. The radiator clanked and hissed like all old New York radiators, but it was my radiator in my space, keeping me warm while I made decisions about how to spend my time and energy. I started writing letters to the local newspaper about elder abuse, sharing my story anonymously but highlighting the signs and resources that might help other elderly people recognize when they're being exploited. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out through the paper, sharing their own experiences and asking for advice. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a 78-year-old woman whose son had moved in with her after losing his job, supposedly temporarily, but had been living there for 3 years while contributing nothing to household expenses and treating her like an unwelcome guest in her own home. I feel guilty even writing this, her letter said. He's my son. I should be willing to help him. But I'm lonely in my own house, and I'm running out of money, and I don't know how to tell him he needs to leave without feeling like a terrible mother. I wrote back immediately, sharing resources for family mediation and legal aid, but also sharing something more important: permission to value herself. Permission to set boundaries. Permission to believe that being a good parent didn't mean accepting destruction from an adult child. We began corresponding regularly, and eventually met for coffee in Manhattan. Her name was Dorothy, and she'd been widowed for 8 years, raising children and caring for elderly parents before finding herself alone with a son who saw her house as free accommodation and her social security check as supplemental income. I keep thinking that if I'm patient enough, kind enough, generous enough, he'll remember that he loves me and start treating me better, she told me over coffee that tasted like hope and possibility. I thought the same thing about my daughter for years, I told her. But love isn't something you can earn by accepting mistreatment. And if someone requires you to be destroyed in order for them to feel loved by you, then what they're feeling isn't love at all. Dorothy nodded, tears in her eyes. I know you're right. But knowing and doing are different things. They were. It had taken me 73 years to learn the difference between knowledge and action, between understanding what I deserved and demanding it. Over the following months, Dorothy and I supported each other through the difficult process of setting boundaries with adult children who'd grown accustomed to taking everything and giving nothing back. She eventually gave her son a written notice to move out, with 60 days to find other accommodations and contribute to household expenses in the meantime. His reaction was predictable: rage, accusations of cruelty, threats to cut her off from future contact with potential grandchildren, claims that she was becoming mean and bitter in her old age. All the manipulation tactics Linda had used on me, deployed against another mother who decided she deserved better. But Dorothy held firm, supported by our conversations and the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her experience. When her son finally moved out, angry and unforgiving, but unable to dispute the reasonableness of her request, she called me crying with relief. I'm scared, she said. But I'm also free. For the first time in years, I can watch what I want on television, eat what I want for dinner, have friends over without worrying about his reaction. Is that selfish? It's human, I told her. Being human isn't selfish. Spring came again, bringing with it the anniversary of the day Linda had handed me that eviction notice. A year ago, I'd been a terrified elderly woman facing homelessness because her own daughter had stolen her rent money. Now I was a woman with her own apartment, her own bank account, her own schedule, her own sense of worth. I marked the anniversary by doing something I'd never done before. I threw myself a party. Not a big party, just Rosa, Dorothy, a few friends from my volunteer work and book club. We crowded into my small apartment, sharing food and wine and stories of survival and transformation. A toast, Rosa declared, raising her glass of cheap wine like it was the finest champagne. To women who learned that respect is not negotiable, even when it comes from family. We drank to that, and to friendship, and to the radical act of choosing ourselves over people who demanded our destruction as proof of our love. Later, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning glasses and storing leftover food, I found myself thinking about Linda. Somewhere in the city, she was probably dealing with a new baby, learning what it meant to be completely responsible for another person's well-being. Part of me wondered if motherhood would teach her empathy, would help her understand what I'd sacrificed for her over the years. But mostly, I hoped her child would grow up learning different lessons about love and family than Linda had demonstrated. I hoped her child would learn that relationships should be mutual, that love doesn't mean accepting abuse, that families work best when everyone's dignity is protected. I didn't wish Linda ill. I wished her growth, understanding, the possibility of becoming a better person than she'd been when she was destroying me. But wishing her well and allowing her back into my life were two completely different things. As I got ready for bed in my own space, surrounded by things I'd chosen and plans I'd made and dreams I was still learning to have, I realized that the most important thing I'd learned wasn't about Linda or family or money or any of the external circumstances that had brought me to this point. The most important thing I'd learned was this: I was worth protecting. My peace was worth defending. My life was worth living on my own terms, even if those terms didn't meet other people's expectations or needs. At 74 years old, I was finally learning to be my own advocate, my own priority, my own definition of family. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. 2 years later, I heard through Michael that Linda and David had divorced. Apparently, the financial stress of living beyond their means had finally caught up with them, and without access to my money, they'd had to face the reality of their spending habits. The marriage hadn't survived the adjustment. Michael also told me that Linda had reached out to him, asking for help with childcare now that she was a single mother. He'd agreed to provide some support, but under strict conditions: transparency about finances, specific arrangements for repayment, boundaries around manipulation and guilt trips. "She's learning," he said during one of our monthly phone calls. "Slowly. Maybe being cut off from both of us taught her something about consequences." I was glad to hear she was learning, but I had no desire to test whether those lessons were real or just strategic. Some bridges, once burned completely, can't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once revealed to be fundamentally exploitative, can't be reformed into something healthy. I'd spent too many years hoping Linda would change, making excuses for her behavior, sacrificing my well-being for the possibility that she'd eventually appreciate my love. I wasn't willing to spend my remaining years making the same hopeful mistake. But I was willing to spend them building something better. Dorothy and I had started a support group for elderly people dealing with family financial abuse. We met monthly at the senior center, sharing stories and resources, helping each other navigate legal systems and family dynamics and the complex emotions that come with setting boundaries with people we'd once trusted completely. Each meeting brought new faces, new stories that were heartbreakingly familiar. Adult children who'd stolen retirement savings. Grandchildren who'd run up credit card debt in their grandparents' names. Spouses who'd hidden financial abuse behind claims of love and protection. But there were also stories of recovery, of people who'd learned to protect themselves without losing their capacity for appropriate love and generosity. People who discovered that setting boundaries didn't make them cold or bitter, it made them available for healthier relationships with people who valued them properly. At 75, I realized I'd become something I'd never expected to be: a teacher. Not in a classroom, but in the lived experience of someone who'd survived family betrayal and learned to thrive afterward. People sought me out for advice, for support, for the simple validation that their experiences were real and their pain was legitimate. "How do you get past the guilt?" was the question I heard most often. "How do you stop feeling like you're being selfish for protecting yourself?" My answer was always the same: by remembering that your well-being matters too. By remembering that being someone's parent or grandparent doesn't mean being their victim. By remembering that love is supposed to make your life better, not destroy it. These weren't easy lessons. I'd spent decades learning them the hard way, making sacrifices that weren't appreciated, giving trust that wasn't honored, offering love that was exploited. But perhaps those difficult years had served a purpose beyond my own experience. Perhaps they'd prepared me to help others navigate similar challenges with less damage and more dignity. On quiet evenings in my apartment, surrounded by books and plants and the accumulated evidence of a life lived on my own terms, I sometimes thought about the letter Linda had never written me. The letter where she acknowledged the harm she'd caused, took responsibility for her choices, and genuinely apologized for treating me like an ATM rather than a human being. That letter probably would never come. Linda might well spend the rest of her life believing she was the victim in our story, that I was unreasonable and cruel for cutting her off, that family should forgive everything regardless of the damage caused. But I'd stopped waiting for that letter years ago. I'd stopped needing her acknowledgement of my worth in order to believe in it myself. The most powerful moment of my transformation hadn't been confronting Linda or setting boundaries or even filing legal charges. It had been the moment I decided I was worth protecting, regardless of who agreed with that assessment. At 76, I took another trip to the Catskills, this time with Dorothy and Rosa for a weekend of hiking and painting and celebrating another year of choosing ourselves over people who demanded our destruction. We stayed at the same bed and breakfast, ate at restaurants we couldn't afford in our old lives, and talked late into the night about dreams we were still learning to have. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked on our last evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Cutting them off completely?" I thought about it seriously before answering. Did I regret losing the relationship with Linda? Did I regret never meeting my grandchild? Did I regret the family gatherings that would never happen, the gentle old age I'd once imagined surrounded by grateful children and loving grandchildren? "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that Linda chose money over love, manipulation over honesty. I regret that I waited so long to protect myself. But I don't regret the decision itself. I don't regret choosing dignity over destruction." Rosa nodded. "Some people think family means accepting anything, forgiving everything, sacrificing yourself completely. But that's not family, that's slavery." We sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the distance, night birds were calling to each other across the darkness. The sound was lonely but not sad, creatures finding each other in the vastness, creating connections that were chosen rather than imposed. That night, lying in a bed that smelled faintly of lavender and mountain air, I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been over the years. The young mother working 2 jobs to pay for ballet lessons. The middle-aged woman sacrificing her retirement savings for her daughter's wedding. The elderly woman sleeping on a friend's couch because she'd been robbed by her own child. Each version had been doing the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. Each had been motivated by love, even when that love was being exploited and manipulated. None of them deserved the treatment they'd received, regardless of their mistakes or limitations. But this current version, the woman lying in a comfortable bed in a mountain inn, surrounded by friends who valued her properly, planning days that belonged entirely to her, this version had learned something the others hadn't. She'd learned that love without respect isn't love at all, that family bonds maintained through sacrifice and manipulation aren't bonds worth maintaining, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own destruction. I fell asleep that night not to the sound of traffic and sirens and neighbors arguing, but to the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant rush of a stream running clear and free toward whatever destination awaited it downstream. When I woke in the morning, sunlight was streaming through white curtains, and I could hear Rosa and Dorothy making coffee in the little kitchenette, talking quietly about their plans for the day. For a moment, lying there between sleep and waking, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the path that had brought me to this place. Not gratitude for the pain and betrayal and loss that had marked the journey, but gratitude for surviving those things with my essential self intact, for learning that I was worth protecting, for discovering that the most important relationship I could build was the one with myself. At 76, I was finally living the life I was meant to have. Not the life I'd planned as a young woman, not the life others expected me to live, not the life dictated by obligation and sacrifice and the needs of people who confused love with ownership. I was living my life. Chosen, protected, valued, free. Have you ever lived, or known someone who lived, something like this? Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where love was measured by your willingness to be destroyed? Where family connection required the sacrifice of your own worth and dignity? Please, share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters. Your voice matters. You matter. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that you deserve relationships that honor your worth rather than exploit it, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. It helps me continue sharing these stories of survival and transformation, reaching people who need to hear that they're not alone in their struggle. Remember, respect is not negotiable, even when it comes from family. Your well-being matters. Your peace is worth protecting. And it's never too late to choose yourself over people who demand your destruction as proof of your love. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that stories like this one matter, because they do, and so do you.